because these are direct evidence of demolition, not just saying that they can't come up with an explanation. These features that were documented by the numerous photographs and videos taken of these events show that they had this explosiveness, all these features like this. The blast waves were so intense that they just blew out the windows all throughout these financial center buildings that were 400 feet away from the nearest tower. It hurled debris, and this is like 400 feet up in the tower, just explosively hurled in all directions, steel pieces being blown as far as 500 feet radially, all directions from the towers. Demolition squibs are features seen in controlled demolitions where puffs of dust suddenly emerge from the facade. And these are seen clearly in the North Tower. They're much more apparent when you watch a video, and these squibs just instantly pop out of the building with velocities of maybe 100 feet per second. They just shoot out of the building by 100 feet. And they're well below the area of complete destruction. So these couldn't possibly be caused by floors falling down and squeezing out air, because if that's the case, then what's generating all this pulverized concrete up here? The floors are the only concrete element in these buildings. And yet you have these high velocity gas ejections occurring as much as 20 stories below the zone where the whole building is just breaking up. The way I describe what happened to the towers is that I don't think you can get around calling these explosions. They exploded into these clouds of dust with steel hurling in all directions. And these explosions became over 500 feet in diameter by the time they reached the ground. Actually, more like 800 feet in diameter. But the reason I think people don't think of them as explosions is because they occurred over a period of 15 seconds in either case. So there wasn't a particularly, normally people think of an explosion as you hear a loud crack, a bang, and then it's just that one event. But if you have, in the case of a demolition where you might have thousands of explosions that are all blending in, then you get one huge explosive event, but you don't hear any distinct explosions that's so much above the roar of it. The thing sounded sort of like an ocean wave, just this incredibly loud roar. But incredibly explosive. The tops, I described them as mushrooming because they blew out so far. This is the North Tower, and this distance here is about 120 feet. The tower is 207 feet across the face. So this is only a few seconds into the collapse, and this stuff is being hurled out with a lot of lateral energy to be thrown that far out. And they mushroom, and this cloud just becomes larger and larger as it goes straight down to the ground. The symmetry is probably the most telling element. I spoke a little bit about that earlier, in that they followed the vertical axis of the building. The destruction followed the axis of the building in both cases all the way down. Even in the case of the South Tower, where the top had started to lean for 2 seconds, and then it just disintegrated and just went all straight down to the ground. Hurling debris in all directions. The steel skeleton was shattered and thrown for distances up to 500 feet. The FEMA itself illustrated the fallout pattern. So again, I emphasize that natural phenomena follow the path of least resistance, not the path of maximum resistance. So this is not possibly a natural event, that the tower is just falling down. It's being systematically destroyed. That's the only explanation for the symmetry. Each tower disappeared into a volcano-like cloud of dust. I mean, the comparison of these events to volcanoes is very telling. It was like, when these towers came down, the dust was so thick that it was pitch black on the streets. And the clouds were thick, too. Hanschel talks about this photographer talks about being picked up and carried a block by the dust. It was so thick. And the dust was apparently had the 90,000 tons of concrete in each tower just pulverized into dust so fine that it stayed suspended in the air for a few minutes. So the non-metallic objects in the towers were pulverized to fine dust, including the bodies of people, which 1,000 of which were never even recovered, even though they were looking at little tiny dust samples and using advanced DNA techniques. But the only recognizable objects at Ground Zero were pieces of metal that aren't so easily destroyed. So there was just shards of metal, as if the buildings were just shredded. They were just shredded, and the dust was inches deep as far as blocks away from Ground Zero. That's what happened. The people, the gypsum, the concrete, is all in this dust all over the Manhattan. So very few pieces of steel were longer than 30 feet. It made it very convenient for the cleanup operation. They could load it on trucks without cutting it up. And there was this intense heat that persisted for over 100 days. Ground Zero smoldered into December because there was so much residual heat. So all those are features of controlled demolition, maybe features that are beyond controlled demolition in terms of the excess heat, in terms of the degree of pulverization. But that's all the more evidence that these were controlled demolitions, because to get an event that's even more destructive, you need to put even more energy into the explosives, presumably, that pulverize these buildings.
Lastly, in terms of dealing with the immediate financial returns from the atrocities of 9/11/01, I'd like us to consider opium in Afghanistan. We well know about the oil from Iraq. We know about the pipelines that were wanted through Afghanistan for the Caspian Sea oil. That's been well explicated in even mainstream media. But what is very little mentioned in mainstream media or so-called left media is the opium from Afghanistan and its absolutely crucial role in the world's legal and illegal economies. At the time of September 11th, 2001, the Taliban, the government of Afghanistan at that time, had reduced the amount of opium production within their territory to nothing, really. It had gone from 3,500 metric tons within all of Afghanistan to 187 metric tons. And all those tons were grown by farmers under the control of the Northern Alliance. And what that meant to the world's illegal economy was they lost $180 billion, because that's what that opium was worth by the time it reached the streets of the West. That's a United Nations estimate. It's repeatedly cited in terms of its value. But what it means, more importantly, more consequentially, to the orchestrators, I would like you to further investigate, ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, is its value to the world's legal economy. When those narcotics profits are channeled through the world's leading financial institutions, through the Chase Bank, through Barclays Bank, through Bank of America, because then the value of that $180 billion becomes the almost unimaginable sum of $3.6 trillion. And what that means to us, living as we do in the United States, is that we are complicit with a criminal economy. We're complicit with an economy that depends on people being addicted to heroin around the world. That's what the invasion of Afghanistan was primarily about.